She was there every day at 3:17 p.m. Not 3:15, not 3:20. 3:17. As if she had a tiny broken watch ticking away inside her chest, a precise and heartbreaking internal clock. Leo noticed it the third week he moved into the cramped studio apartment, above the old hardware store, the one that always smelled of damp wood and forgotten projects. His life had become a series of small, quiet numbers, too. Days since the move, 47. Days since he'd had a conversation that lasted longer than ordering a coffee, 23. The number of times he'd almost called his ex, his finger hovering over the screen before tossing the phone onto the lumpy sofa, 2, many to count. But her number, the Tabby's number, was 3:17. The first time he saw her, he thought she was a trick of the light, a smudge of dust and shadow on the cracked pavement across the street. It was a Tuesday. Rain had just ended, leaving the world looking slick and bruised, the sky the color of a faded welder's jacket. Leo was staring out his window, not really seeing anything, just trying to fill the empty hour between job applications. The bus shuddered to a halt at the stop directly across from his building, its brakes hissing like a tired old man sitting down. People spilled out, collars turned up against the damp, not looking left or right. And there she was. A small, ordinary tabby, cat, the kind you'd see on 1,000 different streets in 1,000 different towns. Her coat was a mottled tapestry of gray and brown and black, like a sidewalk after a light rain. She wasn't pretty, not in the way people usually mean. One ear was nicked, a small, permanent V missing from the tip, a relic of some old argument. She sat perfectly, painfully still on the narrow strip of dead grass between the sidewalk and the chain-link fence that bordered the auto body shop. She wasn't looking for food. She wasn't scanning the alleyways for danger. Her entire world, in that moment, was the bus door. She watched the steps unfold, her head tilted just so, her green eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on that dark opening. Her body was coiled not with tension, but with a profound, devastating expectation. She was waiting for someone. The last passenger stepped down, the door folded shut with a pneumatic sigh, and the bus rumbled away, belching exhaust that hung in the wet air. The cat didn't move. She held her position for a full minute, her gaze still locked on the spot where the door had been, as if her sheer will could make it reopen. As if the person she was waiting for had simply been delayed, and would appear if she just believed hard enough. Then and only then did she relax. The hope drained out of her. It was a physical thing. Her shoulders, which had been set in a firm line, slumped. Her head bowed. She looked suddenly very small and very tired. She turned and disappeared into a gap in the fence, a shadow returning, to shadows. Leo let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His own heart was aching, a dull, sympathetic throb. He knew that kind of waiting, the kind that wears you down to a smooth, thin stone. The kind you do because the not waiting, the giving up, is an even more terrifying prospect. The next day, at 3:17, he was at the window. And there she was. The same ritual, the same precise positioning, the same intense, hopeful focus on the bus doors, the same crushing deflation when they closed, the same slow, defeated retreat. It was a silent, solitary play performed for an audience of one, and Leo had a front row seat. He started calling her Matilda. He didn't know why. The name just arrived in his head one afternoon, sounding solid and a little old-fashioned, like her. He began to structure his afternoons around her arrival. His own days had a hollow, shapeless quality to them, but Matilda's vigil gave 1 hour a specific gravity, a weight. He'd make a cup of tea at 3:10. Pull the worn velvet armchair up to the window, and wait. Watching her became his job, his purpose. He noticed the finer details, how the white fur on her chest was splotched like a Rorschach test he could never quite decipher. How her tail, when she was waiting, was perfectly still, but the very tip would sometimes give a single, tiny, hopeful flicker when the door first opened. How after the bus left, she would often sit for a moment and just stare at her paws as if asking them where they were supposed to go now. One Thursday, it was pouring. A cold, relentless rain that turned the gutters into rushing rivers. Leo was sure she wouldn't come. What animal would be that steadfast, that foolish? But at 3:16, a small, drenched shape emerged from under the rusted carcass of an old car in the auto body shop's lot. She was soaked through, her fur plastered to her body, making her look even smaller, more vulnerable. She took her place. Water streamed down her face and she blinked it away, never breaking her focus on the bus stop. Leo's throat tightened. This wasn't just habit, this was devotion, this was faith. He found himself whispering at the window. "No one's coming, sweetheart. I'm so sorry, but no one's coming." The bus came and went. She sat in the downpour, defeated once more. As she trudged back toward the fence, she paused, shivering violently. And then she did something she'd never done before. She turned her head and looked directly up at his window. It was only for a second. Her green eyes met his through the water-streaked glass. It felt like an acknowledgement, a shared, silent understanding of loneliness. It felt like the beginning of something. You're here, listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It wasn't a storm, just a constant, dreary drizzle that made the world feel muffled and gray like living inside a cloud. And every day at 3:17, Matilda was there, soaked, shivering but unwavering. Leo's apartment, which usually felt like a cramped and lonely box, now felt like a command post, a vigil for a vigil. He'd watch her, his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, his tea going cold on the sill, and feel a strange, protective ache bloom behind his ribs. After that first direct look, the one that had sliced through the rain and the glass and found him, something shifted. It was no longer just him watching her. It was them, sharing this silent, sorrowful hour. He started talking to her, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. "There you are, little soldier," he'd say as she took her post. "Another day for waiting." When the bus doors would snap shut, he'd sigh with her. "I know, girl. I know." On the 4th day, the rain finally broke. The sun came out, weak and pale, but it was enough to steam the water off the pavement, giving the whole street a hazy, dreamlike quality. Leo looked at the leftover tuna sandwich from his lunch, the bread a little stale, the mayo congealing. On an impulse, he scraped the tuna onto a clean paper towel, folded it into a clumsy pouch, and went downstairs. The air outside was fresh and clean, smelling of wet asphalt and the distant metallic hint of the city. He felt exposed standing. On the sidewalk, the sounds of traffic suddenly loud in his ears. He crossed the street, his heart doing a nervous little tap dance against his sternum. What was he doing? She'd probably just run away. He approached her waiting spot, the patch of dirt and trampled grass. He could see the faint impression where her small body sat day after day. He knelt down, feeling the dampness from the ground seep through the knee of his jeans. He unfolded the paper towel and placed the small pile of tuna on it, then retreated back across the street to the doorway of his building, trying to make himself small. He didn't have to wait long. At 3:17 precisely, she emerged from her usual gap in the fence. She took 2 steps toward her spot and froze. Her head came up, her wet nose twitching, her ears swiveling forward. She'd smelled it. She looked immediately suspicious, her body lowering into a cautious crouch. She scanned the street, her gaze sweeping over the parked cars, the shop fronts, and for a terrifying second, it lingered on Leo's doorway. He held his breath. She looked back at the tuna, then back at the street. Hunger warred with a deep, ingrained sense of survival. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, she crept forward. Every few steps she'd pause, her entire body alert, ready to bolt. It took her a full 2 minutes to cover the 5 feet to the food. She stretched her neck out, sniffed the tuna without touching it, and then, in a movement almost too fast to see, she darted her head down, snatched a mouthful, and leaped back 3 feet. She chewed quickly, watching, waiting for the trap to spring. When nothing happened, she crept forward again. This time, she stayed, eating in hurried, grateful bites, her eyes still wide with wariness. Leo felt a surge of something so powerful it winded him. It was pride and relief, and a connection so sharp it was almost painful. He had given her something. A small thing, just some leftover fish. But it was a transaction, a silent communication. I see you. I see your struggle. Here. The next day, he was waiting in the doorway with a small bowl of water. He placed it next to a fresh offering of tuna, then retreated. She was less skittish this time. She still approached with caution, but the frantic, fearful bolt was gone. She ate, and then, to his astonishment, she took a few delicate laps of water. Her head came up, droplets clinging to her whiskers, and she looked right at him. Not a fleeting glance, but a steady, considering look. Then she went back to her vigil, taking her place just as the bus groaned to a halt. The routine was intact, but now there was a new layer, a shared secret. The days began to stack up, one after another, like pages in a book they were writing together. Leo's life, which had felt so stagnant, began to take on the rhythm of hers. His mornings were for job searches and stale coffee, but his afternoons were for Matilda. He bought a bag of dry cat food, the cheap kind in the bright orange bag, and a small chipped ceramic bowl from the thrift store down the block. He started calling it porch time in his head, a thing to look forward to. He began to learn her language. It was a quiet, subtle dialect of movement and expression. The slow, deliberate blink she'd give him sometimes from across the street. After she'd eaten, a cat's kiss, he'd read that once. A sign of trust. The way her ears would flatten just slightly, not in fear, but in concentration as the bus doors opened. The particular angle of her tail, a gentle question mark curve when she was waiting for him to put the food down. He found himself talking to her more, his whispers carried away by the wind. "Who are you waiting for, Matilda?" he'd ask. "Was it an old person? Someone who lived around here? Someone who loved you?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered. He'd tell her about his own day, the rejections, the silence. Another, "We've decided to move forward with another candidate email today," he'd confess, and she'd just listen, washing a paw with intense focus, and somehow it felt like she understood. It felt less pathetic saying it to her. The bond was a fragile thing, built in inches and moments. Some days were breakthroughs. A day she didn't wait for him to fully retreat before approaching the bowl. A day she let out a tiny, rusty-sounding merp when she saw him come out the door. Other days were setbacks. A loud garbage truck would send her scrambling under the car for the rest of the afternoon, and she wouldn't come out for her. Food until long after dark, when Leo had to shine a flashlight from his window to make sure she was okay. He started noticing things about the neighborhood he'd never seen before. The old man who ran the auto body shop, who sometimes came out to sweep the same patch of pavement for an hour. The group of kids who cut through the lot after school, their laughter sharp and bright. He was no longer just a ghost in a window. He was a participant, however small, in the life of the street, all because of a cat. The air turned colder, the bite of winter sharpening its teeth. Frost painted the windows of the bus in the mornings, and Leo started wearing his thick, worn-out jacket for their porch time. He worried about her at night. Where did she sleep? Was she warm enough? The gap in the fence led into the auto body shop's yard, a cluttered maze of old tires, scrap metal, and broken-down cars. It wasn't a home. One afternoon, a week before Thanksgiving, the wind had a cruel, icy edge to it. It whipped down the street, scattering dead leaves and empty plastic bags. Matilda finished her food, but instead of immediately turning to her waiting spot, she hesitated. She looked at the bus stop, then back at Leo, who was huddled in his doorway. The bus was late. The wind howled, lifting the fur on her back. She took a step. Not towards the curb. Towards him. Then another. Her head was low, her body language unsure. She crossed the white line in the middle of the road, a boundary she had never crossed before. Leo didn't move. He barely breathed. She stopped about 3 feet from him on the opposite sidewalk. The space between them felt vast, charged. The wind gusted again and she flinched, tucking her tail close. And then she did it. She took the final few steps. She didn't rub against his legs. She didn't meow. She simply walked right up to him, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her small body, and then she sat down. She placed herself perpendicular to him, her side facing his legs, and leaned. It was the faintest of pressures, the softest touch of her fur against his shin. It was not an ask for more food. It was not a demand for shelter. It was a statement. I know you. I am here with you. They stayed like that for a full minute, a man and a cat on a windy sidewalk, leaning into each other for warmth. Leo's eyes, filled with tears, the cold wind stinging them. He didn't reach down to pet her. He didn't speak. He just let the moment exist, perfect and fragile. He could feel the delicate architecture of her ribs against his leg with every small breath she took. It was the most profound moment of connection he'd felt in years. A distant rumble broke the spell. The bus. Matilda immediately stood up, the moment gone. She gave him one last, unreadable look, then turned and trotted back to her post, assuming the position just as the bus hissed to a stop. The doors opened, the doors closed, the bus drove away. She sat for her minute of defeated silence. But this time, when she was done, she didn't slink back to the fence. She turned, walked back across the street, and paused in front of Leo. She looked up at him, gave that slow, deliberate blink, and then disappeared into the alley next to his building. She had broken the routine. She had chosen him, if only for a moment, over the ghost she waited for. Leo stood there for a long time after she was gone, the spot on his shin where she had leaned still humming with a phantom warmth. The apartment felt different when he walked back inside. The silence didn't feel so heavy. The walls didn't feel so close. He had been seen. He had been chosen. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he could never let her spend another night in the cold. The leaning changed everything. That single, silent press of her body against his leg on that windy afternoon was a key, turning in a lock he didn't even know existed. Leo's world, which had for so long been monochrome and flat, suddenly had texture. He found himself noticing the quality of the afternoon light, the way it hit the crumpled fender of an old car in the shop lot and turned it to liquid gold for a few minutes before fading. He started buying higher quality cat food, the kind with real chunks of fish and gravy, telling himself it was just practical, that she needed the calories for winter, but knowing, deep down, it was an offering, a thank you for that moment of trust. Her routine remained, a religion she practiced with devout precision. 3:17 p.m., the bus, the hope, the crushing quiet when it left. But now, after the bus had gone and she'd paid her respects to that particular heartbreak, her new ritual began. She would turn from the curb, and instead of immediately vanishing, she would look for him. If he was in the doorway, she would amble over, sometimes for a few scraps of food, sometimes just to sit nearby. A quiet companion in the deepening afternoon. She never tried to come inside his building. She never meowed at the door. It was as if she understood his apartment was his territory, and the street was hers, and the doorway was their neutral ground, their embassy. But a new thread began to weave itself into their afternoons, a thread that was strange and faintly unsettling. It started with the feather. It was a small, bedraggled thing, a gray primary feather from a pigeon or a sparrow, dirty and torn at the edges. One Tuesday, after the bus had departed, she came over to him not with her usual slow walk, but with a purposeful trot. She had something in her mouth. She stopped a foot in front of him, dropped the feather carefully on the pavement, looked up at him, and let out a soft, questioning murp. "For me?" Leo said, his voice hushed. He bent down and picked it up. It was light, almost weightless. She watched him intently, her head cocked, as if waiting for his verdict. It's great, Matilda. Thank you." He didn't know what else to say. He tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. She seemed satisfied, turning to wash a paw with sudden casual disinterest, as if the whole transaction had never happened. He thought it was a one-off, a strange, random gift. But 2 days later, she brought him a twisted piece of blue plastic, the kind that might have once been part of a pen. She presented it with the same solemn ceremony. Then came a bottle cap, rusted and sharp, a soggy, unidentifiable piece of yellow ribbon, a single, pristine, fallen autumn leaf, bright red, which she carried so gently it was unmarred. She never brought these gifts during her waiting time. They were always offerings presented after, once her duty to the bus was done. It was as if she had two separate lives, the one dedicated to a memory and the one she was building haltingly with him. The gifts felt important. They felt like clues. But to what? Leo started a small collection on his windowsill. The feather, the least rusty bottle cap, the leaf pressed under a book to keep it flat. They were sad, worthless treasures. But to him, they were priceless. They were proof of a bond. He found himself wondering, his mind tracing and retracing the possibilities. Was this what she did with the person she waited for? Did she bring them little trinkets? Was this her love language, the only way she knew how to say, "I was thinking of you"? Chaipur. Weather grew colder, the days shorter. Darkness began to press in at the edges of the afternoon by 4 p.m. Leo's worry, which had been a low, constant hum, now grew into a persistent ache. He bought a small, insulated pet shelter meant for feral cats, a little igloo-style dome made of foam. He lined it with an old wool sweater that still smelled like him and placed it in the alley next to his building, where he'd seen her disappear, tucked behind a dumpster to shield it from the wind and prying eyes. He showed it to her one afternoon, pointing to it like a real estate agent presenting a new listing. She sniffed the entrance, peered inside, and looked back at him with an inscrutable expression. He didn't know if she'd use it. He just had to hope. The gifts continued, each one a tiny mystery. He began to anticipate them, this strange, silent game they played. He'd wait for her to finish her vigil, his heart aching for her, as she watched the bus leave and then feel a flicker of anticipation. What did you find for me today? What piece of the world are you going to share? One afternoon, she didn't come. 17 came and went. The bus arrived, disgorged its passengers, and left. The sidewalk was empty. No small Tabby form sat watching. No one came to mourn its departure. Leo felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather. He stood in his doorway for 20 minutes, then 30, his eyes scanning the gap in the fence, the shadows under the cars, the mouth of the alley. Nothing. The panic was sudden and absolute. It was a physical thing, a fist closing around his windpipe. Had she been hit by a car? Taken by animal control? Had she just finally given up and moved on? The thought was a desolate emptiness, a void opening up inside him. He realized, with a shock that left him breathless, how much of his own stability had become tethered to her predictable sadness. Her routine had given him a routine. Her presence had given him purpose. Without her, he was just a lonely man in a doorway again. He didn't sleep well that night. Every sound from the street, a car door slamming, the wail of a distant siren, had him bolting upright, heart hammering, convinced it was her. But it never was. The next day, he was at the window by 2 p.m., a nervous energy thrumming through him. He drank too much coffee. He couldn't focus on the screen of his laptop. The numbers on the clock seemed to drag themselves through molasses. 2:47. 3:02. 3:16. And then at 3:17 she was there. She emerged from the alley next to his building, not from the auto body shop. She looked different. Worn. Her fur was matted with dirt on one side. She walked with a slight stiffness, a barely, perceptible limp. But she went to her post. She sat. She waited. The bus came and went, and the defeat that settled over her this time seemed deeper, more profound, a heavier weight on her small shoulders. As it left, she turned and limped towards him. Her eyes were dull. She didn't have a gift. She just looked up at him, and she let out a sound he had never heard from her before. It wasn't a meow. It was a low, quiet groan of pure exhaustion. It was the sound of a creature that was just so very, very tired. She didn't ask for food. She didn't ask for pets. She just walked past him, into the alley, and disappeared, towards the little shelter he'd made. She had come back, but she'd come back changed. Something had happened. She had vanished for a night and a day and returned carrying a new kind of quiet pain. Leo stood frozen in the doorway, the cold seeping through his shoes. The mystery was no longer a gentle curiosity. It was a pressing, urgent worry. The gifts hadn't been just gifts, they were messages. And her absence was the loudest message of all. She was trying to tell him something, and he was only just now beginning to understand that he needed to listen. Really listen. The fear of losing her was no longer an abstract concept. It was a cold stone in his gut. This fragile connection was the most real thing in his life, and he could feel it fraying. He had to know. He had to find out where she went, what she was doing, what she was carrying besides broken feathers and bottle caps. The quiet, observational part of his life was over. The need to act, to protect her, was a drumbeat in his blood, growing louder and more insistent with every labored step she took into that dark alley. The cliffhanger wasn't a loud event. It was the silent, determined set of Leo's jaw as he watched her disappear. He would wait until the next time she vanished, and then he would follow her. The waiting was a different kind of agony now. Before, he had waited with a dull, passive ache. Now, every minute was a wire pulled taut, humming with a terrible anticipation. Leo watched Matilda like a hawk, but he was no longer just watching her sadness. He was studying her for signs of departure. He noticed new things. The way she would sometimes pause before entering the alley after their time together, her nose lifted, testing the air as if listening to a distant call only she could hear. The way her disappearances weren't entirely random. They often followed a particularly cold night or a day when the rain had been relentless, as if hardship itself was the trigger. He made a plan. It felt absurd, melodramatic. He was going to follow a cat. But it wasn't just a cat, it was Matilda, and the limp she'd come back with last time hadn't fully faded. It was a ghost of a hitch in her step, a slight favoring of her front right paw. That tiny imperfection fueled a protective fire in him that burned away all hesitation. He prepared a go-bag. The term made him let out a short, bitter laugh in the silence of his apartment. It was a canvas tote with a bottle of water, a Ziploc bag of dry food, a can of the stinky tuna stuff she loved, a small flashlight, and an old towel. He felt like a spy or a crazy person. Probably both. 2 days passed. She was regular as clockwork. 3:17, bus, defeat. A brief, quiet visit with him. A gift. This time a smooth gray riverstone. Then back to the alley, presumably to the shelter he'd made. He started to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing, if her previous absence had been a fluke. On the third day, the sky was the color of lead, and a freezing, misting rain began to fall around noon, coating everything in a thin, invisible layer of ice. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes the world feel hollow and unfriendly. Leo knew. This was the kind of day. He positioned himself not in his doorway, but just inside the main entrance to his building. The door cracked open, his go-bag at his feet. He was a silhouette in the shadows, praying she wouldn't sense his heightened anxiety. At 3:17 she appeared. She did her duty, but her heart didn't seem in it. She was quicker today, more agitated. The bus left. She didn't even look his way. She went straight to the alley, but she didn't go towards the shelter. She turned the opposite way towards the back of the building and vanished into the deepening gloom. Now. Leo's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He gave her a 30-second head start, counting slowly in his head, each number a tremor. He slipped out, pulling his hood up against the nasty drizzle, the tote bag slung over his shoulder. He felt like a criminal. The alley behind his building was a dead end, clogged with overflowing dumpsters, the sour smell of rotting garbage fighting with the crisp, icy air. At the very back was a high wooden fence, but someone had pried a few boards loose, creating a gap just wide enough for a person, or a cat, to squeeze through. He'd never had a reason to go back here before. He saw the faint, wet imprint of her paws in a patch of mud leading right to the gap. He squeezed through, the rough wood snagging on his jacket. On the other side was another world. It was a narrow, forgotten corridor of backyards and the rear lots of various businesses. There was a labyrinth of chain-link fences, overgrown thorny bushes, and piles of discarded lumber and pallets. The light was fading fast, the premature dusk of a winter storm. For a terrifying minute, he thought he'd lost her. The world was silent except for the drip, drip, drip of water from a leaky gutter. Then, a flicker of movement about 50 yards ahead. A gray-brown shadow darting behind a stack of old tires. He moved as quietly as he could, his boots crunching faintly on the gravelly ground. He kept his distance, using the junk and the fences as cover, feeling a ridiculous surge of adrenaline. He followed her through this urban jungle for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes. She never once looked back. She had a purpose, a destination. Her limp was more pronounced on the uneven ground. This was a journey she made often, and it was taking a toll. They emerged onto a residential street he recognized but had never walked down. It was a street of tired-looking duplexes and small post-war houses with sagging porches. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, wavering shadows. Matilda trotted along the sidewalk with the confidence of someone coming home, then ducked into the overgrown yard of a particular house. It was a small, sad-looking bungalow. The paint was peeling. One of the gutters was dangling loose. The front yard was a tangle of brown weeds and a single bare-limbed tree. But it was the porch that stopped Leo dead in his tracks. It was empty, save for a single weather-beaten rocking chair. But on the side of the house, tucked almost out of sight from the street, was a small, ragged flap in the siding. A cat door, old, chewed at the edges. Matilda didn't hesitate. She vanished through the flap. Leo stood on the sidewalk, the freezing rain soaking through his hoodie, his mind reeling. This was it. This was where she went. This was the home of the person she waited for. But the house had a profound emptiness to it. No lights were on inside. The windows were dark. A pile of unopened mail was visible on the floor just inside the front door. The air around the place was still and cold, devoid of life. He didn't know what to do. His mission was complete. He'd found her secret. But now what? Knock on the door? What would he say? "Hi, I've been stalking your cat." He felt a fool. He was about to turn around, to retreat back through the alley, to leave her to her other life, when a sound stopped him. It was a tiny, high-pitched, desperate sound. It was so faint he almost mistook it for the wind. But it came again. A mewling. A cry. It wasn't Matilda's voice. It was younger, weaker, and it was coming from inside the house. A cold dread, entirely separate from the weather, washed over him. That wasn't the sound of a person living there. That was the sound of something abandoned, something in trouble. He forgot his fear, his hesitation. He walked up the overgrown path to the front door and knocked. The sound was too loud in the quiet street. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. "Hello?" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Is anyone home?" Silence. Just that faint, desperate mewling from inside. He tried the door handle. Locked. He peered through the front window, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the reflection. The living room was empty. Dusty. A single chair was overturned. The place looked ransacked or abandoned in a hurry. The mewling came again, more frantic now. It was coming from the back of the house. Leo's heart was hammering. He ran around to the side of the house to the cat flap. He got down on his hands and knees, the wet grass soaking through his jeans. He pushed at the flap, but it only swung inward. He couldn't see much. Darkness. Matilda. he whispered, his mouth close to the opening. "Matilda, are you in? There?" He heard a soft thump from inside, and then her face appeared in the opening. Her eyes were wide, glowing in the dim light. She didn't hiss. She didn't run. She looked at him, and she let out a low, urgent trill. It was a sound he'd never heard from her. It was a sound of profound distress and plea. She backed away, and he knew with every fiber of his being that she was asking him to follow. He looked at the flap. It was too small for him. He stood up, his breath coming in ragged white puffs. He scanned the backyard. There was a small single-pane window, low to the ground, probably for a basement or a crawl space. One of the panes was cracked. Without thinking, acting on a pure primal instinct, he took off his jacket, wrapped it around his fist, and punched the cracked glass. It shattered inward with a loud, horrifying crash. He reached in, unlocked the latch, and pushed the window open. It was a tight squeeze, but he wriggled through, falling into the dank, cold darkness of a basement. The smell hit him first. It was the smell of dust and mildew and loneliness, and underneath it, the sharp, unmistakable scent of cat. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling so badly he could barely switch it on. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating a concrete floor, old boxes, a broken washing machine, and in the far corner, under the stairs, was a nest. It was made of torn-up old towels and newspapers, and in the center of the nest was Matilda. She was curled around 3 tiny, squirming shapes. Kittens. They were so small, their eyes still, closed, their mouths open in silent, hungry mews. Matilda looked up at him, her body tense, her eyes huge in the flashlight beam. But she didn't move to protect them. She just looked at him, and then she looked down at her babies and then back at him. The message was clear. They are why. They are everything. This was her secret. This was where she went. Not to another person, not to another home. She was a mother. She was caring for her babies in this cold, dark, abandoned place. She was hunting for them, scavenging for them. The gifts she brought him weren't just trinkets. They were a mother's offerings, shared with the only other being who showed her kindness. The bus stop. It wasn't just a memory. It was a hope. A hope that the person who lived here, the person who maybe loved her once, would come back and save them. She waited every day for a savior who was never coming. The pieces crashed together in Leo's mind, and the weight of it buckled his knees. He sank to the dusty concrete floor, the flashlight beam shaking. He understood it all. Her thinness, her exhaustion, the limp, probably from fighting other animals for food. Her steadfast loyalty. She wasn't just waiting for a ghost, she was fighting for a future. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down his face. He was crying for her strength, for her heartbreaking hope, for the sheer, brutal weight of her love. He cried for the person who had left her here, alone. He cried for himself, for his own loneliness, which suddenly seemed so small and self-indulgent in the face of her monumental struggle. He didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, crying, letting the truth wash over him. Matilda watched him, and then, slowly, deliberately, she uncurled herself from around her kittens. She stood up, her body thin and fragile in the light. She took a few steps toward him, leaving her most precious things vulnerable behind her. It was the ultimate act of trust. She walked right up to his slumped form. She didn't rub against him. She didn't meow. She simply pressed the top of her head, firmly and deeply, into the palm of his trembling hand. It was warm. It was full of trust. It was an absolution. It was the moment of understanding. She wasn't asking him to be the person from the bus. She was asking him to be Leo. She was telling him her story, and in doing so, she was giving him a purpose far greater than any job, any past relationship, any lonely afternoon spent staring out a window. She was giving him a reason to be brave. He looked from her earnest green eyes to the mewling pile of kittens in the dark corner. The storm had passed. The mystery was solved. And now, the real work was about to begin. The world in the basement was reduced to the circle of Leo's flashlight beam, the 3 tiny mewling lives, and the weight of Matilda's head against his hand. It was a perfect, silent contract. The crying was over. The hesitation was gone. There was only a cold, clear certainty that filled the hollow spaces inside him, a purpose so direct it was like a compass needle snapping to true north. "Okay," he whispered, his voice rough but steady. "Okay, sweetheart, I'm here, we're going." He moved slowly, deliberately, showing her his every intention. He shrugged the tote bag off his shoulder and unzipped it. He took out the towel, shook it open, and created a soft, deep nest in the bottom of the bag. He kept up a low, murmuring monologue, a stream of calm reassurance meant for both her and himself. "Just a little trip, gonna get you all someplace warm, someplace safe. No more cold floors, no more hiding." Matilda watched his every move, her eyes tracking his hands, but she didn't flinch. She didn't hiss. She had made her choice. She had asked for help, and now she was trusting the process. She returned to her kittens, giving each one a few rough, loving licks, as if preparing them for a journey. Gently, so gently, Leo reached into the nest. The kittens were lighter than he could have ever imagined, little handfuls of warmth and frantic heartbeat. They squirmed against his fingers, their tiny cries amplifying. One was a gray tabby like its mother. One was black with white socks. The last was orange, the smallest of the 3, its movements weaker, more fragile. He placed them one by one into the towel-lined nest in the bag, creating a warm, wriggling pile. They immediately burrowed into each other, seeking the familiar warmth of their litter. Matilda tensed for a second as he took the last one, a low noise of concern rumbling in her chest. But when he placed the kitten in the bag and she saw them all together, safe, she relaxed. Leo picked up the bag, holding it carefully against his chest. He could feel the tiny movements through the canvas, a vibration of life against his heart. "Come on, Mama," he said softly. "Time to go home." He led the way back to the broken window. He passed the bag through first, setting it carefully on the wet grass outside. Matilda didn't need to be told. She leaped through the opening with a quiet grace, immediately putting her face to the bag, sniffing urgently, checking on her babies. She let out a soft trill of reassurance. "I'm here. I'm still here." The walk back through the alley, through the gap in the fence, and across the street to his building was the most important journey of Leo's life. He carried the bag like it contained the most precious, fragile jewels in the universe. Matilda walked beside him, so close her fur brushed against his leg with every step, a constant, quiet vigil. She wasn't following him. She was walking with him. He brought them into his apartment and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking shut was the sound of a chapter ending and a new one beginning. The silence of the studio was instantly different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft, rustling sounds from the tote bag and the quiet rhythm of Matilda's breathing. He worked quickly, fueled by a nervous energy. He cleared out a low cupboard in the kitchenette, creating a dark den-like space. He lined it with soft blankets and an old sweatshirt and carefully transferred the kitten pile into their new home. He brought over bowls of water and the high-quality gravy food, placing them nearby. Matilda investigated everything with a cautious sniff. Then, satisfied, she climbed into the cupboard and curled herself around her babies. The sound of contented nursing soon replaced the frantic mewling. A deep, rumbling purr started up from the cupboard, a sound so powerful and sustained it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Leo sat on the floor a few feet away, his back against the refrigerator, and just watched. He watched this small, brave family, safe and warm for the first time in he didn't know how long. The tight knot of anxiety that had lived in his chest for weeks, for months, for years, began to slowly loosen. The days that followed were a soft, hazy blur of routine, but it was a routine built on warmth, not waiting. Leo's world shrank to the dimensions of his studio apartment and expanded to contain an entire universe of love. He learned the personalities of the kittens as their eyes opened, revealing tiny, bright blue marbles that would later change color. The gray tabby was the bold explorer, first to venture out of the cupboard. The black one with white socks was the playful clown, pouncing on invisible foes. The little orange one, who he named Peanut, remained small and needed to be fed extra from a bottle, a ritual Matilda would watch over with intense, serious eyes. And Matilda blossomed. With consistent food and the safety of walls and a roof, her fur grew thick and soft. The nick in her ear remained, a badge of her past life, but the haunted look in her eyes faded, replaced by a calm, deep-seated peace. She never tried to go outside. The bus stop held no power over her anymore. Her vigil was over. She was a devoted mother, but she was also Leo's shadow. She would follow him from room to room, not demanding attention, just present. She'd curl up on the chair next to him while he worked, her purr a quiet engine of contentment. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he'd wake to feel her weight on the bed, curled against his legs, a warm, breathing blanket. He still looked out the window sometimes. The world kept turning. The bus still came at 3:17, but he was no longer just an observer. He was a participant. He had a cat who needed fresh litter. He had kittens who turned every cord into a prey animal. He had a purpose. One afternoon, about a month after he'd brought them home, he was on the floor playing with a feather toy, a swarm of kittens tumbling over themselves to catch it. Matilda was watching from the sofa, her eyes half closed in, a look of serene amusement. The sun was streaming through the window, painting a bright square on the floor. It was an ordinary, perfect moment. The feather toy broke, sending a shower of tiny iridescent filaments into the air. The kittens pounced on the pieces. Leo laughed, a real, unforced sound that surprised him. As he started to clean up the mess, Matilda jumped down from the sofa and walked over to him. She had something in her mouth. It was a habit she'd kept, bringing him little things. A crumpled-up receipt, a stray piece of kibble, a twist tie. This time she dropped it into his palm. It was the river stone, the smooth gray stone she'd brought him on that last day before he followed her. He must have left it in his pocket, and she'd somehow found it and fished it out. He held it in his hand, its surface cool and smooth. It wasn't a sad treasure anymore. It was a relic, a reminder of the day everything changed. It was her final gift. Not a cry for help, but a thank you, a symbol of the trust that had saved them all. He looked at her. She looked back at him and gave him that slow, deliberate blink. A cat's kiss, a seal on the contract. He kept the stone. He put it on the windowsill, next to the feather and the leaf. It was his collection now, his museum of a second chance. Love wasn't a dramatic rescue. It wasn't a single grand gesture. It was the quiet act of showing up day after day. It was the warmth of a purr in the stillness of the night. It was the weight of a head against your hand, trusting you with everything. It was the understanding that sometimes the most loyal heart you'll ever find is the one waiting patiently for a bus that never comes, until you're brave enough to become the bus. You stayed till the end, thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.